everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing the 4 cards I made using the Scrappin' for Less January Flavor of the Month card kit. This kit is all coffee themed, and there's a quick overview of the contents of the kit. Now each kit comes with 4 collections. In those collections, there's a set of pattern papers, as well as a stamp, sequins, and usually some sort of an embellishment. As a banana split level subscriber, I get an additional bag that contains another stamp, usually either a die, an embellishment of some sort, and a coloring medium. So jumping right into card 1, for card 1 I'm using collection 1 and I'm following sketch number 1. In the interest of time management for these several cards in one video, I typically will color off screen, and I typically will die cut all of my components so that I'm just showing you the way I put together the card. I'm going to try something new and do a separate video for the Copic coloring, and I'll have a link to that in the screen. So for this first card, I'm using the craft cardstock from the kit. I've die cut the bottom panel to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I just used some vintage photo distress oxide ink to ink up those edges. And then I took another panel that I've cut to, I believe this one was like 3 1/2 by 4 1/4. And I'm taking some peel-offs that I happen to have in my stash, and I added those just to the edges, just to finish off the edges. And then the last panel, that one is cut down to, I believe, 2 1/4 by 3 1/4, and I've adhered that panel off towards the left. And then working on the sentiment, which reads "Coffee and you keep me humming along." I used another piece of the craft cardstock, and I'm using the vintage photo distress oxide ink to stamp the sentiment down. And I'm sorry I'm a little bit off screen here. But once I have that in place, I use a My Favorite Things stitched banner or flag banner die, I believe, to die cut the sentiment out. And then I again use the distress oxide to ink up those edges to sort of tie everything in. And then, courtesy of some of the other designers on the Scrappin' for Less team, I saw this trick where you use your T-square ruler to line up your components, and I think it worked very well. And then I take my focal point panel and I use some fun foam to add to that to pop it up. And then I can adhere that in the center of my card. And then I decide I'm going to pop it off so that I can ink up the edges. And then I'll just pop that right back into place. The benefit of using liquid glue is you have a moment or two to change your mind. And then I can go ahead and adhere my panel to a card base. And I typically make my card bases, and I don't know what's been wrong with me lately, but I can't seem to get that measurement. I just seem to always have such a piece that overhangs that I have to trim it down. Anyway, I did color in one of the hummingbirds, and I thought I'd add some fun foam and pop it into the right hand corner as sort of a embellishment and to kind of tie in that sentiment. So I added the fun foam, and then I can use some liquid glue to adhere that down. And there is my first card finished. The second card follows sketch number 3 and uses the contents of collection number 2. And I colored little Newton up as if I have a cat that looks a lot like that. And so that was my inspiration behind that card, or behind the coloring of the cat. So the polka dot paper, I've used one of the largest Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle dies to die cut that piece. And then I added that to a white card base. And then the pink paper, I decided I was going to add a white mat to it this time, just to sort of differentiate between one layer and the next. And I had a little trouble there trying to get enough glue into that corner. So once I have that glued, I can go ahead and add some adhesive to the back and put that in place. And then I used my favorite thing, stitched Fishtail flag stackable die to die cut that banner. And I'm just trying to line it up to where I think it looks good. And then I can add some adhesive to the back of that and add that in place. And I kind of wish that I would have left a little more of that pink paper to be seen. I felt like it just, in the end, it just lost its place. Anyway, I use a piece of black cardstock to mat my focal point panel. And then I can use my trimmer to trim that down. And then I can just line it right back up, and I decided to use some fun foam to pop up that panel. And once I have that in place, I add some adhesive to the back of the fun foam. And then I can try to center. And again, I kind of wish I would have had a little more of that pink paper showing, but it's okay. So in the sketch, there was a circle element off to the right hand bottom corner, and instead of using another pattern paper, I decided to color up these small donut images and use that as my element. And I just used a circle die from my stash and I cut those out, and then I just used a hole punch and cut out the center. Although I think I could have left the center in. It would have been totally fine. It may have even looked better. So I arranged those and I pop up a couple of the edges of the donuts with some foam just to give them a little support. And then as a final touch, I take my Wink of Stella. This is the clear glitter, and I add that to the top of my donut, or all of the donuts, I should say. And there's a completed second card. The third card I made follows sketch number 4, and I decided to do a shaker card. Now, shaker cards are not my thing. I struggle with it. So to add to my dilemma, I decided to make a double shaker card. Now, I made several mistakes when I created this card, and I left those in because, honestly, that's how we will learn. Anyway, I used a MFT stitched dome stackable die to create a frame, and I've die cut 2 of the frames from the cardstock that came in the kit. Once I had that completed, I used the frame that I cut to line them up, and then I cut out the center using the smallest of the die. And I did that twice just so I can get a double shaker. The image I colored off screen, and again I will have a link to that video up above. And then I can use some of the pink cardstock and mat that focal point image. And then once I have that glued down, I can use my paper trimmer and just trim off, leaving a small border around the focal point image. So here's where I start running into trouble. I had the piece of acetate in my hand and I left it off to the side. So then I started to add my fun foam to the back of the shaker. At some point I realized, or I will realize, that I did not put my acetate down, and then I will have to pop off some of that foam to do that, which wasn't the very worst thing in the world, but this is why shaker cards are not my thing. There's just too many steps for me and I get lost along the way. So if anybody happens to have any good tips to creating shaker cards, I would love to hear them down in the comments below. So I think at this point I realized I forgot to put my acetate down. So I'm using some double-side adhesive to add those in place so that I can adhere my acetate instead of using liquid glue. And the fun foam was fairly easy to pop up. I didn't press it too hard into place, and so it was fine. But I think an easier method would have been just to get one long piece of acetate across both of the shakers and been done with it. But no, not for me. So I've got one side completed, and now I'm working on cutting up those teeny tiny fun foam. And I guess I did the second acetate off screen. Now here's trouble number 2. I wanted to use those cutout pieces at the bottom of the shaker, and being slightly OCD, I just couldn't get them to line up the right way. They were always off just a smidgen. So I give up on that idea and I decide I'm just gonna use the white background, which in the end it was fine. So I thought to include the coffee beans, but they were just a little too bulky for that card, and I was not going to be adding any more layers to the fun foam. So I used the sequins from the collection to add those in. And then I used some liquid adhesive to add to my fun foam so I can adhere my card base. And when I do adhere my card base, I adhere it backwards. and I didn't check my card, and so here it is. It's adhered backwards, and it honestly, it wouldn't have bothered me because the shaker element is symmetrical, and so it wouldn't have mattered. But those teapots, or whatever they are, they're just more upside down than right side up, and that bothered me. So I had to cut off the back of that card base and just add another one in its place. And by this point, I was so over this card. I was just ready to finish it and move on. And honestly, this card took me the longest with all of the goof ups I did and starting over. And anyway, in the sketch, the sentiment strip is off to the right, and since I stamped my sentiment at the bottom, I decided to use these little pieces of wood veneer as my embellishments. I believe these are in one of the other collections, but it sort of went well with this card. And I just cut off a little piece of white cardstock just to back the sentiment one. And I intended to put that panel askew. That was my intent all along. And then I can just adhere those couple of little pieces. I'm using multimedia matte to adhere those down, and that completes my third card. So for my last card, I'm using collection number 4, and I'm following sketch number 2. I've got all of my components die cut. For the largest rectangle, for the largest cardstock panel, I've used a Lawn Fawn large rectangle stitched die. And I can adhere that to my card base. Once I have that in place, I use the second pattern paper, which I've also die cut with a stitched rectangle die. And then I can place that in the center. And then finally this little tiny strip of cardstock, I die cut that. And I did follow the sketch measurements that were listed for this one. Usually I just make my own stuff up, but this one I did follow along. And then just to kind of finish up those edges, I used some more of the black peel-offs that I had. And I get those in place. And then I thought I would use the oval element, but somehow that pattern paper was just throwing everything off, so I decided to use my little girl just all by herself, and I'm using some fun foam to pop that image up. So once I have that in place, I'm going to work on the sentiment. The sentiment reads, "You can brew it." And I'm just going to directly stamp that on that little rectangle panel. I'm using my embossing buddy to remove any static, and then I can use my Versamark ink to stamp that sentiment and heat set that with white embossing powder. And then while I was using the heat tool, I believe those peel-off stickers are vinyl or something of that sort of material. Anyway, one of it just kind of melted and curled, and so I just had to pop it off and replace it. And then I can adhere my little girl down, and that will complete my last card. So here's a look at all 4 of the cards that I made using this kit. Let me know what you think of these. My favorite happens to be Newton. Let me know in the comments below which one is your favorite. If you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up button. It really helps me to build my channel. If you like the content that I create, please consider subscribing to my channel and hit that notification bell to be notified when I post new videos. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.